Right, hello. Well, good evening or good morning, whenever you're watching this, everybody. If you probably remember last week, I asked Dino to do a little bit of research on this parable of the rich man and Lazarus. I always thought it was really, really a bit off when we ever. I don't think the society ever dealt with it very convincingly, to my opinion. If you're going to use a parable, why use a parable? Of something that wasn't really happening, because as far as the witnesses were concerned, of course, nobody, even going back to Moses and all these guys, got a resurrection. All these guys, of course, we know would have an earthly resurrection in the paradise, and those who were heavenly bound of the 144,000 would only be taken up whenever Armageddon's about to start, where someone would be raised. So in other words, no. So in other words, the only person who'd be resurrected, as far as we're aware, according to the witnesses, is Jesus, and he did his resurrection. That was it. And yet you have this strange parable where two blokes die, one's rich and one's poor, who seem to have straight away this change from earthly life to this other life, which seemed to be not being taught or believed by anybody. So I just thought it was a bit off. Why do the parable if that wasn't the belief? Otherwise, people thinking, what you want about? It didn't make any sense to me. So I'm going to hand it over to Dino now to see if it can make any sense to him.
Oh yeah, it's as you say, it is a strange passage in light of what else we can gather from the scriptures about what the Jews believed at that time. And it's interesting though that unlike most of or other parables that Jesus used, the witnesses treat a lot of his parables, like the faithful and discreet slave, as literal. But
Yeah.
they recognize in this one that it is a parable. We're not talking literally, which is unusual for the witnesses, because they tend to read a lot of the scriptures very literally. But yeah, so this passage falls into two camps. The one camp who do read it literally, and there was some church fathers, some of the patristic writers, Irenaeus, for instance, he believed it as a literal passage. Um, yeah, so there's always been that divide between is this a teaching on the afterlife? Is it a teaching on
Yeah.
hellfire and such like? And
Mhm.
I mean, in fact, I got stopped in the street once by a sort of born again preacher, and we were talking about this, and they still very much point to this as if it's hellfire as awaiting those who don't get born again. Um, but yeah, it's also fairly well. It is unique, this passage, because it's only Luke chapter 16 that records it, which is unusual in the Synoptic Gospels, because the Synoptic Gospels usually, as the word suggests, they have the same view and they record the same sort of passages, the same events. But here it's only Luke that mentions this. And as I said before, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's a lot of sharing of accounts. Certainly, Luke and Matthew would have used the Gospel of Mark for a lot of their material. So they shared the same sort of resources. But here it's only Luke that has this account. So that, to my mind, marks this out as quite different.
Mm.
And I'm tending to think that, and I've got no proof for this. I've looked, tried to find resources, but there's nobody else saying this, and I wouldn't stand by this hard and fast. But I mean, we know that there are interpolations into a number of the writings, where you've got like various short and long endings tacked on to the end of the Gospel of Mark. John as well. There's I think chapters 21, 22 were added by an editor later, whereas
Yeah.
John's Gospel probably originally finished with chapter 20. So we know there's interpolations, there's additions, there's editing done to a lot of these writings. And I say I've got no proof for this. I won't stand by this hard and fast. But reading this, it does seem out of place to me.
Mm,
And I tend to think that again, this is a might be an occasion where words are getting put into Jesus' mouth here. Because I mean, there are other instances in the Gospels, particularly the Gospel of John. A lot of modern theologians now believe that we're not getting the vox verita, the true voice of Jesus. It's the Bible writers are putting into his mouth teachings that they want to get across. It's not necessarily um, something that was definitely said by Jesus. You know, it's a bit like it's maybe a bad example, but it's a bit like a ventriloquist dummy. You've got the character, and then the ventriloquist can say what they want through the mouth of
yeah,
that character. Um,
yeah,
so the this passage does sound to me, though it's not maybe a passage where it was a real event that was witnessed by an eyewitness, because the Gospels, although some of them purport to be eyewitness Gospels, modern theologians realise that they're not eyewitness accounts. They're either taken from, well, basically tradition and sometimes oral tradition. So a lot of it can be second hand. And I think this passage could well fall into that. But anyway, so we read it, and the Jehovah's Witnesses read it as a parable. It's not to be taken literally. It's not talking about a real um, heaven and hell here. For various reasons, it couldn't be taken literal. Um, the fire and water, would they
yeah,
exist in a spiritual realm?
yeah, 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 yeah,
It makes no sense. Can you converse? Well, it's often said, can you converse between heaven and hell? Because there's a conversation that apparently is going on between the rich man in Hades and
yeah,
the Lazarus in Abraham's bosom. Now, it doesn't necessarily say that Abraham is in heaven. Um, doesn't say that. It just says that Lazarus has been taken to the bosom position of Abraham. Um,
yeah,
So it's not necessarily speaking about heaven, but if it was, could there conversation be had between heaven and hell? Again,
yeah,
it's not to be taken literally. Um, but as you said, our understanding of what the scriptures say, the old classic one, Ecclesiastes chapter 9, talks about um, Hades or Sheol. There's no speech, there's no thinking, there's no word in Sheol, there's no thinking. It's a place of the grave is a place of silence, right? So the Jewish thinking was that when you die, um, you're not automatically going to heaven. You're going to Sheol, which was the grave, the land of the dead. But it wasn't, I mean, and they didn't believe in the immortal soul. So, because that, as we know, um, is a Platonic teaching. That's Greek Platonic um, thinking about immortality of the soul. So that's not strictly Jewish thinking. So
mm,
this passage seems to be is a sort of a mix-up between trying to talk about Jewish matters, but it's mixing it up with what's clearly Greek um, thinking about the dead.
yeah,
And I read one place where it's talking about that even some of this sort of imagery and type of parable could even have come from Babylon, because we've got to remember that when the
mm,
Jews were exiled in Babylon, they would have picked up a lot of the Babylonish ideas and thinking, and that get carried on into the thinking later on. Um, so it clearly doesn't read like a Jewish understanding of the dead, the condition of the dead. So what is it really talking? Oh, one other thing is to say, I think you pointed this out as well, that at that point in time, Abraham wouldn't have been in heaven. You know, John
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
3:13 says that no man has ascended to heaven but him that descended, the Son of Man. So
Yeah.
even then they would have thinking these patriarchs would have been in Sheol, would have been in the grave,
Yeah.
not in heaven. Um, of course, you could then, as I was pointing out, it doesn't necessarily say that Abraham is in heaven. So when it's talking about Hades, well, that's the Greek version of Sheol. So we are talking about the land of the dead. So if anything, it's saying that the rich man, Lazarus, and Abraham were all in Sheol. They were all in the
Mm.
one place, all in Sheol.
Right.
Um, but clearly, it's just trying to make a point. So what point is it trying to say? Well, the rich man, um, dressed in purple linen, I think it says. So he's dressed in sort of a priestly garb. So it's really commenting on the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the sort of a priestly hierarchy, who had wealth at that time as well, and contrasting them with the ordinary man. And usually in parables you don't have proper names, but in this one Lazarus
Yeah.
is given is a proper name, and that's made some tend to think that maybe this was a real event because it's a proper name. But really, Lazarus, I think we to take it a bit like a common name like Johnny or Jimmy, as they would say in Scotland. Hey, Jimmy. It's a sort of common name meaning the common man, um, basically. So it's contrasting the ordinary man against the Pharisees and the Jews, and it's trying to make the point that because of their rich position and their hierarchy and looking down, that they have missed the gospel again that Jesus is teaching. They're missing the point about Jesus and his miracles and what he's been doing. And we can
Okay.
maybe tie into this point the name Lazarus. Well, we know Jesus apparently raised Lazarus of Bethany. I think it was Bethany he
Mm.
came from. Um, so is it also drawing attention to the fact that they were mocking and disbelieving the miracles that Jesus was apparently um, doing by raising Lazarus from the dead? So they weren't showing the faith in this Messiah that was in their midst. Um, and then it goes on to say that the rich man says to send, um, as it says, send to my father's house where I have 5 brothers, warn them so that they too may not come to this place of torment. But Abraham
Yeah.
said that they have Moses and the prophets, let them listen to them. Um, no, Father Abraham replies, but if someone from the dead visits them, they will repent. And Abraham answered, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will pay no heed, even if someone should rise from the dead. So the point seems to be is that the they're trying to say to them that if you really knew Moses and the law and the prophets, if you really understood the scriptures, you would realize who Jesus was and you would pay attention to him and not
Yeah.
mock him. But it's saying that because you're not getting that, there's no point sending you anything else because you're just not going to believe. It's a bit like saying you've closed your mind off, and even though you've got a form of religion, a form of belief, and you've got position, because you've closed your mind, you've got everything in front of you that you need, but you still don't see it. So it wouldn't matter even if it raised someone from the dead to come and tell you, you wouldn't believe it. And of course, that's then it could be referring to the fact that they wouldn't believe that Lazarus was a proper resurrection that actually happened. And then, of course, is it talking about Jesus' resurrection? So
Yeah.
even if
Yeah.
Jesus was to be resurrected from the dead, they probably
Yeah.
still wouldn't put faith
Yeah.
in Jesus as the Messiah. Um, but that point itself might belie a bit of anachronism, that it's a later thought that's been written into an event that happened before. You see,
Yes.
so the gospel writer in his day, this was written what, maybe the 70s or 80s CE, right? So at that point, the Jews were clearly still rejecting the fact that apparently Jesus had been resurrected. So this was the argument they would be making with the Jews in all the various
Yeah.
territories they'd be preaching in. So they're trying to say that the Jews don't believe because Jesus says it wouldn't matter even if someone returned from the dead, you still wouldn't believe because you're hard-hearted. Um, so again, as I say, it's a wee bit of an anachronistic comment into a passage that doesn't, they're from two different time slots, you
Mm,
know.
mm,
So again, it
mm.
makes me think that this isn't necessarily a literal account where it's something where Jesus actually said this actually happened, and that this was an experience, something that Jesus said that he used this. Because frankly, it doesn't sound quite right to me anyway.
No, I know.
I don't, but certainly I question whether this is a genuine Jesus words, this is his words, or whether this is words being put into his mouth, because it's a
Mm,
bit like any sort of mythical character, um, modern myths, or Star Wars, Star Trek, take your pick, Lord of the Rings. You have a
yeah.
mythical characters which can portray um, principles, can portray for you ideals that you want to get across. So you put the words into, you use those mythological figures to get the story across. So,
Yes.
we've got to watch a lot of the gospel accounts um, are maybe mythical accounts. They're not truly Jesus' words, but that they're using Jesus to get points that they want to get across. Um, so I think that's what is going on here. I can't. When I was looking for the sort of usual sources that are usually quite good on pointing out passages that are that have been added to the gospel at a later time, but nobody was saying that about
Yeah.
this passage.
Yeah.
For instance, I mean, and it's not unusual because in my own studies last year, we were talking about Bible criticism, about source criticism, and one of the things I've came to the conclusion is that Luke, the Gospel of Luke, chapters 1 and 2, excuse me, I believe Luke 1 and 2 are actually add-ons to the Gospel. I actually believe that Luke, the Gospel of Luke, really starts from chapter 3. That's the original beginning. The chapters 1 and 2 were additions because 1 and 2 are basically the nativity passages, which are added to create the nativity scene to try and show Jesus as born of the son of David, etc.
Mm,
Um, and these passages were not original to the gospel, but were added at some point. So it's not unlikely that there's other parts of the gospel that could have been added. But I can't say hard and fast about that, but certainly 1 and 2, um, because we tend to think that the Bible came down and all these books came down to us as they were. But, you know, 19th century, 20th century studies have shown that, and with the discoveries of new manuscripts, the theologians and textual critics now know that there's been a lot of changes, a lot of manuscript variants, accounts. We can't just take the written word as we have it as exactly as it was as written. You know, it's very good. The Bible we have
Hmm.
is close, but we can't say it's exactly what was written because we don't have any extant manuscripts from the first
Yeah.
century. The earliest Greek manuscripts are from maybe second at the very earliest, and third and fourth for most of the, might even be third and fourth actually, so the earliest Greek manuscripts of whole Bibles, you know. Um, but yeah, so that's what I got from that passage.
Yeah.
But it definitely is a strange one.
Yeah, I always thought it was. It's. I just thought you read the whole thing and you're thinking, but hold on a second. This just even what the people at the time believed didn't make any sense of what their belief was the afterlife. And of course, it's then sort of went what then Jehovah's Witnesses said as well. And it just thought, yeah, but it's a parable. Okay, I get that. But why use a parable as something that does, usually you do a parable and it's something you can relate to really easily
Yeah,
and I just thought it just seems so really off the charts because they're thinking, hold on a second, we don't believe that, so we don't
yeah,
believe that Abraham's there. It just none of it made any sense then or now, which
yeah,
may come back to what you said, that it has been written in as an addition to years
yeah,
later to just say, well, this is you, based on the thinking maybe 300 years later. It may be
yeah,
that it's a bit
yeah,
like if we imagine, if we fast forward 1,000 years and we look at all the things that Donald Trump says, you then
mm,
say clearly somebody actually he's a bad example because if you look at the
mhm,
things that he said, if you looked in the house, he says, no, surely somebody couldn't have said those things. What
yeah.
we know he did because he's on record as saying them. But of course, we don't have Jesus on record, and so we don't really know what he said. We're only what we've got left to us today. So.
This is the thing. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I find it strange that when we're reading the scriptures, and why didn't Jesus leave writings behind? Why
Oh,
didn't
yeah,
he write books and passages?
yeah,
Maybe he did and they were destroyed, but it seems strange. It seems strange that it was left to simply his followers. If you were the Son of God and being
yeah.
inspired, um, why didn't he write anything? I
Did,
find
did
that strange.
Did he ever say, well, this is, of course, did he ever say? We don't know. But is it ever recorded that he said to his gang, write down all these things, lads? Is it ever recorded he actually said that? And if he did say that, why did only a few of them do instead of like the collective, um, you know what I mean? That everybody put in a wee bit. Obviously,
Oh,
a few got killed,
right.
not long after us. But why wasn't are there more not are there all more writers where people said, "Hold on a second, you've got that story completely wrong." Oh no, no, no! I was standing next to him at that bit. Don't you remember that bit? It seems like for all the people who were in his company at the time, it seems odd that there's very little, and that I don't think. And was anybody taking any verbal notes? When he was doing like the
Well,
Sermon on the Mount, who was then going
yeah,
right? Hold on, can you just say the last bit again? Because I never quite. I just want to put this down. It's like
yeah,
when were these things ever written down and based on whose memory?
yeah. Well, I can partly answer that by saying that there were other gospels. I mean, the four canonical gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are not the only gospels. You tend to think when you're sort of growing up and you're getting taught that those were the only writings. No, there was lots of gospels. There's famously the Gospel of Thomas, which we spoke
Thomas,
about
yeah,
briefly a number of
yeah,
weeks
yeah,
ago.
yeah,
So
yeah.
there's a Gospel of Thomas, and um, that a manuscript of that, not the full manuscript, but parts of it were discovered some years ago, and basically that's it's a gospel basically of Jesus' sayings. allegedly, the Thomas has recorded. It's not like a narrative gospel like these ones are. It's called a sayings gospel, whereby he's noted down, I think it's about 140 sayings, apparently, that was what Jesus said. But
Yeah.
that sort of gospel was basically buried. I mean, it's only came to light, as I say, a number of years ago.
No.
So it was long sort of buried and gone and forgotten about. And then there's Gospels of his brother James, who was the sort of head man in Jerusalem after he died. There's the Gospels of Mary. There's the Gospels of Thecla, I think. Thecla is another one of the believed to be one of the female disciples who was very prominent within the group. But again, because of the sort of misogyny then, that
Mm.
her writings were buried and not kept alive, as it were. So there's lots of gospels that were not accepted as canonical, um,
Yeah.
and you got to remember that what we now have as the canon wasn't really kind of formally established until about 180 CE.
Mm.
Um, it was a gradual thing, and there was always disputes about what books could go into the canon and which ones didn't. I might have mentioned before, for instance, the book of Revelation was very late in being accepted into the Bible canon. A lot in the first couple of centuries didn't believe it was a Christian book at all. And so the Bible that we have now is come to us after a long period of sifting out other writings.
Yeah.
Um, so we have absolutely um, no guarantee that what we've got is all that we should have. Right? There might even be books. I mean, for instance, the Gospel of Tom. I've not read it, but I've read just wee parts of it. Um, but I mean, there might be some of the expressions in there are actually the Vox Verita of Jesus, like exactly what he said, which
Yeah.
hasn't been recorded in the canonical Bible.
Right.
We really don't know.
The point of this is, but if we were on the Sermon on the Mount, how would we remember what he said? Do you know what I mean? It's just like, do you know what I mean? You had no. How would you reference? Oh, I think he said. Oh, no, I thought he said. Do you know what I mean? It's who was actually taking the notes? Did Jesus say, right? Get your pens, get your quills out. This is going to be really, really important. Right, and so okay, Jesus, let's go. Oh, can you say that last bit again? It's just like this is what I struggle with because even when we think about some of the alleged things that allegedly we have gone down that people have said today, even going back to things like maybe William Wallace was supposed to have said. Um, recorded by a guy called Blind Harry 135 years after his death. I think when Robert the Bruce killed John Comyn in Dumfries, and he said things then. Who recorded that? It's who recorded the very words that somebody says. You can imagine, yet somebody afterwards being descriptive and saying, "Well, I'm pretty sure that's probably what he says." Don't know these things. Even when we come back through things that even in more modern day speak would just say, you think, did they really say that, or is just that now an urban myth or an urban legend that nobody knows what they said? We just accept it like um, Shakespeare. Everybody thinks that when Richard III fell off his horse, he suddenly shouted like, my kingdom for a horse." He never said those words. Shakespeare then thought it would be good if he said them, but of course, now we all accept that's what he said because it's a film. Because you can see Lawrence Lewis saying, "My kingdom, my kingdom." Oh, come on! It's just that when you come down to a lot of these things, it's like we don't really know, and that's probably why that when I said to you about the rich man story, we don't know where that comes from. We don't know where it comes from.
Yeah,
But again, has it's just got as much validity as the Sermon on the Mount, because we don't know who actually at any point really. wrote down those words, and so they're as accurate as maybe Jesus actually presented them.
You're right. You're right. I was reading something recently where it suggested that the contents of the Sermon of the Mount are very similar to something, and I can't think exactly what it was, but there was some other passage, some other writing that's very similar to what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. So was it the case that again that the later writers
Yeah,
have
yeah, yeah,
used something and amalgamated it into something that Jesus said and did, and
yes,
that's what we've been given, that it's a
yeah,
sort of a mishmash,
yes,
um, which is lovely writing and lovely sentiments, but is it
exactly.
truly exactly what was said on the
What was
Mount?
said, yeah,
You know,
right.
so and this is the thing about a lot of religions, and the witnesses are the same, where they tend to think they brought us up to believe that the Bible was inerrant. There was no mistakes in it, and that it's univocal. In other words, every book from Genesis to Revelation are never going to contradict each other. That
Mm,
they're all it's as if they are written. Well, they say well, it is written by the one hand because it's written by God, but
yeah,
really it's not. It's written in different ages, different periods, by different people in different languages. So
mm,
it's a collection of writings. It's not univocal,
no,
um, and
it's
there
not.
are contradictions in it. So you got to
Yeah,
stop looking at it as if it's inspired in the sense that um, it's 100% correct on everything accurate and it's
mm,
word for word what Jesus said. Probably
yeah.
isn't.
Right. Anyway, I think we have to call it a day there because it's we'll get into that point. But anyway, yeah, thank you for doing that because it just came to my head last week when we were speaking. It's just something that's always bugged me for, you know, over 50 years. And I just thought, if it'd be interesting to see. But again, it's quite what you said probably now makes more sense to me now why that's in there than ever before. So you've enlightened me. So, and
Good stuff.
hopefully anybody else that's watching this, it's enlightened them too, which is what I wanted you to do. So, thank you again
Good.
for that, Dino.
Mhm. Could I offer you maybe a suggestion for next week? I've seen
Okay.
recently about there's a watch to a study article to be studied in December, I think, and it's talking about preparing older ones to face the fact that they might have to die before the end comes.
All right. Okay.
Um, I don't know if you've
All
seen
right.
that yet, but I think
No.
it's a study article for December, and
Right.
I've seen one or two videos on it. I just thought maybe that's something we could talk about um, because they seem to be
Right.
now a- after
Yes.
Let's saying his video about we're now at the sort of the end of the last days of the very last days of the last days. They're now
Yeah.
writing articles saying, "Oh, some of these are actually going to have to die before the end comes."
Including Stephen Lett. Yeah, that's interesting. Right, okay, yeah, we'll discuss that because that obviously it's completely well, we can actually go back and reference people that we brought up with who are no longer with us. Right, anyway, good stuff. Right, anyway, we'll have to say goodbye. Dino, thank you again.
Yep.
Time to say goodbye, Dino. Goodbye,
Goodbye. Do you
Dino.
not see you
Right.
all again later?
Thank you for everybody watching. It's just to come up here that Dino's just put a new video up on his channel, The Faithful Departed, saying two beings or not two beings. That is the question. So if you want to deep dive again with Dino, head that way. Otherwise, we'll see you same time next week, probably on the subject of Down Before the End. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Say bye.